followed the experience of el-Nahda closely for quite some time, and I am familiar, for example, with the works of Rashid Ghannouchi, and I've also, met and interviewed el-Nahda officials and leaders before. But of course, spending time here at such a crucial phase, especially now that they're in government, I think that the party and movement are in a different position now compared to, say, a year and a half, 2 years, and certainly 4 or 5 years ago before the revolution happened. And it's such a striking shift because they had no presence and no organizational structure in the country just really 2 years ago. And now they are the ruling party of Tunisia, and nowhere else in the region do you see such a striking shift. In comparison, if you look at the Brotherhood in Egypt, they were part of the society for the last 40 years, and that's why they were able to Islamize society to some extent and to really gain a presence on the ground and to build an organizational structure. So it's not so surprising that after all of that building and grassroots development that they would rise to power. But I think it's incredible to see, Hizb Ennahdha go from where they were to where they are now. Well, I think part of the problem in the Nahda party now is that there's something of a vacuum. If you go beyond Rashid Ghannouchi, there aren't clear successors, let's say. So if Ghannouchi steps down from his position as the leader of the party, who would really be able to kind of to be the glue that pulls everyone together? Because I think what people don't always realize is that el-Nahda has a variety of different currents within it. It's not just people who are like Ghannouchi. No, I guess you can say that you have a liberal wing, you have a centrist wing, and then you have the conservatives. And I think the gap between the left and the right is actually quite large, unlike some other Islamist movements in the region. And, on one pole you have someone like Sheikh Abdel Fattah Mourou, who is very much a liberal and is barely an Islamist. I mean, he doesn't really talk about the Islamic side as much, and, he only recently returned to the party after having disagreements with Ghannouchi and others in the leadership for quite some time. On the right, you have people like Habib al-Luz and Sadiq Shuru, who have much more of a Sharia focus. They say that Sharia is important if the people want it, and that has to be reflected through the democratic process. And they also feel that the leadership has maybe been too compromising and has made too many concessions to the secular and liberal opposition. So I think it's very interesting to look at how those different trends interact with each other. Well, Tunisia, I think, is unique for a number of reasons. Number one, it's relatively homogenous. Nearly everyone is Arab and Muslim. So you don't have some of the sectarian divides that you see in other countries in the region. You have an Islamist party that, as I said, has a reputation for being the most quote-unquote moderate or conciliatory or pluralistic and so on. And it's a different debate about whether or not that's actually true, and some would probably take issue with that characterization. But also I think what's really striking to me as someone who spent so much time in Egypt and Jordan is that Tunisia feels different, and it's very obvious, when you're walking in the street and you see it, you feel it. And it's clear that the French cultural influence is very much present. And there's also a strong secular influence. I mean, Tunisia is really the only country that I can think of in the region where you have a lot of people, yes, they might be a minority, but they're a significant minority of those who we might call laïciyun, or laïcists, or people who believe in the French aggressive model of secularism, let's say, that are very sensitive about religion being in the public and political sphere. So in that sense, you don't, there's a real divide between those on that end of the spectrum and the Islamists of el-Nahda, and they have a very different vision for where the country should go. But I think that's important because it puts a limit on how far Ennahdha can go, because there is an opposition that is vibrant, that is organized, that has secular ideas about the role of religion. So when Ennahdha kind of, let's say, overreaches, or it tries to introduce some controversial elements into society, or say the constitution, you have a kind of resistance there that is built into the society, which I'd say that you don't have in a place like Egypt, where even the so-called secularists or liberals all say that they believe in the role of Sharia in public life, and they all say that they believe in Article 2 of the Constitution, which says that the principles of Sharia are the primary source of legislation. Here in Tunisia, you have people saying, no way, we don't want even a hint of the word Sharia in the Constitution. You know, it's risky for Islamists to be in power for a number of reasons, especially, I would say, in a place like Tunisia, because there's another unique thing about the Ennahdha party here in Tunisia. In most of the rest of the Arab world, you have at least a technical separation between the political party and the religious movement. But here in Tunisia, the movement is the party and the party is the movement. And even when you walk into el-Nahdha headquarters, and the sign that's there, it says Hizb Harakat Ennahdha. And what does that mean? The party of the el-Nahdha movement. That's confusing. That's confusing. So there is no real separation between the two now. So what does that mean? It means that their experience in power is even, I would say, more problematic than it otherwise would be, because if el-Nahdha fails, and if Tunisians look at their government and say, well, we had such expectations for el-Nahdha when they first came in, but we're not seeing results on the ground, and they start to get disappointed, that could potentially undermine the whole Islamic project, the whole Islamic movement in Tunisia, because el-Nahdha as a party is so closely identified with the movement, because again, they are effectively the same thing. On the other hand, if you have more separation, then you can have people who, let's say, disagree with the policies of the government, but they can still be a part of the movement and focus on the non-political side more. The dawah or preaching, religious education, the social service provision. But el-Nahdha isn't as developed as, say, the Brotherhood in Egypt in those kinds of core traditional functions of an Islamic movement. So we've all known that the polarization, it's bad in Tunisia. That's nothing new, and you know, many of us have been following that for quite some time. But I didn't know it was going to be this bad. There was this one time where last year, one of my Egyptian liberal friends, as part of a workshop in Doha, he made a kind of offhand comment. Why don't we kind of trade? We'll take el-Nahdha and we'll give you our Salafis, and then, we'll all be the better for it, because the Salafis in Egypt are more pragmatic. They've entered the democratic process, and the perception is that el-Nahdha in Tunisia is they're the model of what Islamists should be, and that's the perception still among a lot of people in the region. But actually, the reality is different, and there's a lot of, I think, fear and concern about the direction that el-Nahdha is taking the country in. And I think a lot of it comes down to fundamental ideological divides. And I do think there is a real clash. It's not just about political interest. It's not just about power. It's not about political maneuvering. There is something deeper at the root of these societies that, in my view, has not been resolved. So when people say, if only the Brotherhood in Egypt would have done 1, 2, 3, and 4, maybe things wouldn't have been so bad. Yes, it probably would have been less bad, but there was no way we were going to avoid this kind of polarization, because there is something there that is real, and we have to recognize it, and we have to find a way to manage it within the context of the democratic process. And what I'm pointing to here is we have two sides, let's say, that have a different conception of the nation state, a different conception of the role of religion in public life. And that might sound like, well, is that really so important on the day-to-day level? Yes, it's true that for an ordinary Egyptian, that might not matter a lot to his daily survival, but it does get to something fundamental about the identity of the state, the identity of a people. And that really gets to the core of who people are. And that's why the passions, I think, are so strong on both sides, because in a place like Tunisia, you're fighting for the very soul of the country in the way, for the way the society looks. And I think that's pretty serious. And as I said earlier, in Tunisia, you have real secularists who don't want to see even a slight shift in the other direction. And then on the other side of it, you have Salafis who want to see the strict implementation of Sharia law. So that is a very wide divide. But even between the so-called moderate Islamists of el-Ennahdha and those in the less avowedly secular liberal opposition, the gap is still wide. No matter where you look, there are real differences about how to proceed. Islamist parties are Islamist for a reason, because they're Islamist, because they do believe that religion has a role to play in public life. So let's not pretend that el-Ennahdha are nice, fluffy, friendly liberals all the time. No, they're not liberals. They're Islamists, because that's the kind of intellectual background they come from, and they do want to take the society in a more religiously friendly direction. They would like to see Islam more present in the public daily life of Tunisians. There's no doubt about that. And Islamization of society is something that they would prefer to see if possible. And I think you're ready, as we've been talking about, we've already started to see signs that Tunisia might be moving more in that direction. Now, part of the problem is there's such a wide gap between Islamism as an ideology and how to actually implement it in reality. So we can talk about Sharia all we want, but what does that really mean? And I think when you really put el-Ennahdha leaders on the spot and ask them, so what, describe what that means, explain what that means to me, there isn't really a clear vision. It's vague, it's underdeveloped. And why is that? Because part of it is they never thought they'd be in power now. They weren't planning for this. So they didn't really work out all of the challenges of governance, of the practicalities of it. It's different to kind of theorize from exile, as Rashid Ghannouchi did when he was in London, and before that when he was in prison. And he's written some very, I think, notable works of Islamic political theory. But how do you take those ideas and make it into a program of governance? And I think there's even a broader question: is the Islamic State, as Islamic thinkers and intellectuals have conceived it in the past, is that even possible in a place like Tunisia? Is it possible? Or are the constraints so considerable, whether it's from the opposition or the international community, are those constraints so significant that el-Ennahdha won't even be able to go there, even if it wants to? So that's going to be the real challenge. But what I would say is, in most Arab societies, including in Tunisia, there is going to be a constituency that demands, that wants the implementation of Sharia law. So even if el-Ennahdha doesn't supply that, someone else is going to fill the vacuum and come with that program. That's the reality of the matter. So I do think that over time Salafis will gain strength. And in Egypt, they've already become one of the most powerful political actors. I mean, just think about it for a moment, that they won 28% of the popular vote in Egypt's first post-revolution elections. So there is a real ideological diversity within each camp as well. So that's the interesting thing. It's not just between Islamists and secularists. There's debate within the secular camp, and there's debate within the Islamist camp. So that's a lot of ideology going around.